Good evening and welcome. I am delighted that you are here and especially delighted that you all are here. We've spent a lot of time and attention trying to figure out how to train interreligious leaders, how to train religious leaders who don't think of themselves as interreligious leaders, but who are working in a multi-faith context and so are anyway interreligious leaders. And of course, what makes more sense than to talk with people who are out there in the field doing this important work, which seems all the more urgent at this season, shall we say. And no, I'm not speaking about the season of Advent, but the season of post-2016 presidential election. So I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers, and then Reverend Gibbs will moderate some conversation. We're also very excited this evening to be able to celebrate and then learn with the winner of our Rabbi Herman Schulman Interreligious Leadership Essay Award, Teresa Pasquale. It was a very stiff competition. There were some really remarkable essays, but this one was exceptional. So we look forward to that at the end. Tonight we have with us, in addition to Reverend Goods, who you already know and needs no introduction, we have Shannon Mohajir, who is currently working as curriculum consultant for the Interfaith Youth Corps and has done remarkable work with this campus-based organization for a long time now. Rabbi Capers Funye, who's been a longtime friend and rabbinic colleague, who is the spiritual leader, the rabbi at Beth Shalom B'nai Zaken Ethiopian Hebrew Congregation here in Chicago, and also the chief rabbi of the denomination. So it's like, hey, chief rabbi. Cool. Very cool. And Reverend Lisa Syward, who also needs no introduction to most of you, who was our director of admissions and recruitment and is now working as director of spiritual life at Knox College. Welcome back. Welcome to all of you. You've all been here before. This is one of your spiritual homes. So I'm going to leave it right there.
So again, welcome to everyone in the room and especially to our guests. I also want to let you know that we are recording this session so that our online students can hear from you as well. So we are so grateful for your time of sharing. Our Fireside Chat series is an opportunity for our students to get up close and personal with those who are doing the work. And I always like to start these conversations out with hearing your personal call narrative, how you came to your particular faith, and then how you came to the work that you're currently doing in interfaith work. I think it's helpful for those of us who are journeying to hear those stories. So if we can go down the line, and whoever wants to start first is welcome to start there.
I guess I'll start. So my name is Shannon Mohajir, as Rabbi Michael mentioned. I work at the Interfaith Youth Corps. I've been there now for 10 years. So it's been a blessing to grow with the organization and kind of see our work spread far and wide. In terms of a calling, I think there's really two parts to that story for me. There's a part that kind of pushed me into interfaith work when I wasn't expecting to do it, and then there's a part that kind of renewed my commitment in some ways. So I'll quickly share two little vignettes. My family is an immigrant family. We moved to the suburbs of Chicago when I was 16. My parents are expats, so they're from India, born and raised in India, but lived a lot of their adult life in the Middle Eastern country of Qatar, where I was also raised. So I'm one of those people that you call a third culture kid. We don't belong anywhere and everywhere at the same time. So we moved here to the suburbs of Chicago in the late 90s. I found myself at DePaul University, not too far up Lakeshore Drive from here, as an undergraduate student. At the time, if you had asked me why I picked DePaul University, I would have told you it's because it had the least amount of Muslims in the city of all the campuses. So I was not interested in being engaged in religious life as a young person starting college. And it was really discovering and sort of finding myself in Catholic spaces of service and why service was important to the Catholic identity of DePaul that kind of made me question, why is service important to me? And it took me back to my faith tradition because of those experiences on the south side of Chicago in the church of basements of Catholic churches tutoring second graders, right? So that's kind of how I came back to my Muslim identity, and through that work, found myself in a classroom, in front of a classroom of freshman students on September 11th, 2001. I was supposed to do a presentation on why Muslims are supposed to, or feel called to do public service and community service, and that's when we heard that the towers had been attacked. So we didn't have that conversation. And instead we had a different conversation. And in that moment, I had one student on one side who kind of raised his hand and said, "Why do Muslims hate Americans?" And I had a different student on the other side of the room who raised his hand and said, "Why do they think Muslims had anything to do with this? We had nothing to do with this heinous crime." And then I had a third student in the back of the room who raised her hand and said, "I'm from Israel and this happens all the time. I don't know why you guys are so surprised." And I was just like, I have no idea what to do with this conversation right now. We made it work. It didn't implode. But at the same time, I left that room kind of thinking about what it means to be in those spaces and how we navigate those conversations in those moments of trauma and urgency, but at the same time realizing that in order to be handling those moments of trauma and urgency in the way that it needs to be handled, we also have to have a foundation of relationships. And without that foundation, that conversation was not going to be a productive one, even if we tried our best. So that's how I sort of fell into interfaith work, and a few years later found myself at the Interfaith Youth Corps as a staff member, as the 10th staff member to be hired at the time. And now we have about 40-some folks, so it's been great to sort of see that happen. Through my work there, I found myself in Delhi, which is one of, in my homeland, I guess, my parents' homeland, running a interfaith workshop for nonprofit leaders. So they were nonprofit leaders working with youth, with mostly high school age youth, in urban slums, where typically when there's a national flashpoint, communal riots between Hindu and Muslim communities would break out. And these young people were thinking about what are mechanisms we can use in addition to the work that we are doing in order to calm those flashpoints when that happens. So I was standing in front of this room, again, doing this training in like 3 different languages, trying to figure out how we translate words like pluralism that in a way that's meaningful to Indian citizens who don't think of pluralism in the same way as Americans do. So having that conversation, see a woman in the back of the room, sort of listening and not really participating, but very present. After we go through about 5 hours of the training, I pull her aside and I'm like, you know, I'm noticing that you're not participating in the conversation. Are you okay? Do you need to talk about something? And she's like, I'm okay, I'm just processing. You know, it took me a day and a half to get here. And I was like, where did you travel from? And she said, I traveled from Gujarat. And Gujarat is a state where a lot of communal violence has typically broken out over the history of India's independence. And she was from a particular area that had suffered mass violence in 2002. And she was now living in a refugee camp and had lost about 22 members of her family in this violence. And the reason that she was alive was because she was in outpatient surgery the day that the riot broke out with her 5-year-old son. And she's Muslim, and her doctor, who was a Hindu doctor, had the idea to basically put her under anesthesia and to put a red dot on her forehead so nobody would know that she was Muslim when the mob came looking for her, and hid her son in the closet. Her husband and her daughter, who were visiting her a few minutes ago and who left as this doctor was doing this, were part of the 22 members that she lost of her family and have never been found. So this woman is committed to doing this regardless of her deep personal loss. And when you ask her, why is interfaith work important to you, she will say, it's important to me because I do not want another woman in my community, Hindu, Muslim, atheist, whatever, to ever go through that kind of pain. And I want to do everything that I can do, however big or small that is, to ensure that from happening. So that's one of the reasons why I still do interfaith work, maybe not the reason why I got into doing interfaith work.
Well, thank you again. Kapus Panay, spiritual leader of Beth Shalom Ben Isaac, an Ethiopian Hebrew congregation located on the south side of Chicago. And I'm the chief rabbi of an organization called the International Israelite Board of Rabbis. We have congregations in the south, in the east, in Barbados, I wish they would transfer me there.
At least have periodic meetings there.
But we also have several congregations that I lead in Nigeria. We have about 50 congregations in Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana. We also have congregations that are developing in South Africa. We have a community in Uganda and Kenya. I was drawn to the faith, the Jewish faith particularly, because I closed my eyes, someone told me one day, and said, look as far as you can see into the darkness, and that's where you'll find God. And so in so doing, I realized then that I saw no imagery that was representative of God, God's Son, but just the ideal of this absolute and utter nothingness. And in that sense of nothingness is where I met the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I have been studying and been a part of the Jewish community for the last 43 years. Interfaith work for me is an absolute must. Our synagogue is located in what used to be called Marquette Park. Today it's called Chicago Lawn. Marquette Park was infamously known as the place that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said he had never experienced racism and hatred anywhere, and that's a deep statement, anywhere in the South that he felt in Marquette Park 50 years ago this past August. And to that end, I was so proud when we moved to our synagogue, our current location about 15 years ago, that the rabbi of the congregation at that time, in 1966, had reached out to the King movement and said, if you need a place of refuge, this synagogue, you can bring him here to keep him away from the bad guys. This is 1966, and things weren't necessarily all that kosher for the Jewish community there. They were more very quiet and kept to themselves and didn't do a lot of outreach. When we purchased the building, there was a young man walking down the street as I was coming in one day, and he said, "Are you here?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "My name is Rami Nashkinshivi, and I'm the head of Imam, Inner City Muslim Action Network, and I'd like to come in, because I've passed by 100 times, but I never saw anybody here, and I would like to come in and see the synagogue." So I took him in and showed him around the synagogue, and showed him the Sefer Torah, the Bible, and the Hebrew language, and our prayer books. And he said, "Boy, this is really wonderful." He said, "I'm wondering, would you mind if I asked the Muslims, could we host an iftar service in your synagogue?" I said, "What's iftar?" He said, "Well, iftar is the service that we do during Ramadan when we break the fast, and then we break bread together. We would just like to share with you and have you share with us." And so that was the beginning of our work, and we have continued to work since that time with the Imam, with the Catholic organizations and Protestant organizations. We have gathered together. Our area is probably one of the most violent areas in the city with respect to crime, the 8th Police District. So all clergy have gathered together to fight against shootings, robberies, murders, and praying and doing vigils throughout the community. We were very happy that the Muslim community initiated the Martin Luther King Memorial in Marquette Park, and the memorial is all built out of bricks because it was the bricks that hit Dr. King, and we were very delighted that the Muslim community was the spearhead of that particular endeavor for our community, for our city. And I like to think of our community as being a model of interfaith work, of Christians, Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, and whoever else, working together for the betterment of our entire community. We have a lot of undocumented immigrants in our community. So our synagogue, as well as several other churches, are houses of sanctuary for individuals when they're running from ICE. My congregation is very diverse. We have 8 Mexican families. So much that the English isn't sufficient enough that the sermon has to be translated into Spanish each week for the Spanish speakers. So in that diversity of white Jews, black Jews, African Jews, Filipino Jews, Mexican Jews, we are very, very diverse, and so it speaks to our reaching out and being a part of a broader interfaith work, because many of our congregants come from other faiths. We have people in our congregation whose last names are Muhammad, who were raised Muslim, who have thus, over the years, embraced Judaism and have converted to the Jewish faith. So the work is important, and working vis-a-vis interfaith is even more important as we are moving forward. We had a discussion with some members of my congregation that if in fact, and I don't believe it's going to happen, that Muslims in this country have to register, that I feel is something that every person needs to do, particularly from the Jewish community, the African American community, to show solidarity with our Muslim brothers and sisters, and that no community, no single group of people in this country should ever be singled out in totality for the work of a few. And speaking of that, we never see anything against the Timothy McVeighs and other individuals, and here that, that's terrorism as well. But I guess there's a difference when it's terrorism coming from a different ethnic group. So we have to fight collectively as citizens of this country, African American, white Jews, whatever we are. We cannot let any one group be put in a position where they feel threatened and where they feel that they have to register and they cannot walk the streets in safety any place in this country. That's my 50 cents.
Worth at least a buck.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa Syward. I'm the Director of Spiritual Life at Knox College, which is a small liberal arts school on the western side of Illinois, about 3 hours from here. And I've just been in that position recently. I started there at the beginning of September. That position is actually new at Knox College. So Knox College has been around since 1837. They have always been, they were founded by some Presbyterians, but they quickly rescinded that relationship, I suppose, and have considered themselves fiercely secular since about 1870. So they have not, there's no chapel on, they've never had a religious person on there, and there was much resistance to the creation of my position. In fact, there's an outside donor who funded it because it wouldn't have gotten through regular channels. So that's where I am now. How I got there, quickly, I grew up in a family that was, I sort of say, in this lovely non-religious space, right? So I don't carry religious baggage because I didn't grow up in a religious family. And I grew up in a family that every single Saturday we were required to go do Meals on Wheels. I had to get out of bed. It didn't matter how I felt. So it was like many of you had experiences having to go to a particular religious service at a particular time. For my mother, it was like, this is it, this is what you do. So I was definitely instilled with an ethic of wider responsibility to community and to the fact that because my grandparents didn't live in our town, we had to go out and be grandchildren to the elders in our community who didn't have grandchildren visiting them. That was sort of where I came from. And so I studied social work, and I went into social work. Always that sort of understanding as myself connected to the wider community was a huge part of me. Even through college, I didn't put religious language to it. I did undergraduate studies at Michigan State in the late 1980s, and during that time the first gay-straight alliance was being formed at Michigan State University. And the students forming the GSA came to the, 17 of us who were social workers, because everybody in the 80s was doing business and advertising and, things that would make money, right? And then there were like 4 of us, whatever, who were like, no, we're gonna change the world. So the GSA students came to us and said, would you be allies, would you be supportive? And we said, of course, right? And so we started going to their meetings or whatever, and very quickly, this is in the time when hysteria was high around HIV and AIDS, and very quickly we were meeting in the student union. We would leave those meetings and people would be protesting the meetings and throwing rocks at us, right? And there were folks there carrying signs with verses out of Romans. Okay, I will confess to you, I was 20 years old at the time. I didn't understand what the Romans and then the numbers with the colon, I didn't know what that meant. Literally, boom, no idea, right? And people were like, that's from the Bible. And I was like, what? So I had to go look it up, right? So that's my very experience ever of opening a Bible, was to read the texts that were cited on these things. This did not inspire me to want to become a religious person, and particularly not a Christian. So that door got shut pretty tightly and pretty firmly. I went on to do clinical social work for a while and became really burned out. Had some great experiences with some great people, but it was really awful, right? It was just putting Band-Aids on folks and sending them right back out into a war zone. My heart was broken all the time. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. At the same time, I happened to be starting a family, and when my youngest child was born at 3, I was like, that's it. I'm going to take a break and figure out some other way to make some money that doesn't break my heart all the time. And so I was working with a person who was helping me do some vocational discernment. And one of the things she said to me was, Lisa, where does your hope come from? And I thought, huh? You know what? You know, and it was a really important moment for me. It was a really important moment. She started giving me various books to read, spiritual books, spiritual discernment books. And I thought, oh, okay, right, I'll develop the spirituality. Of course it won't be anything Christian because those people are awful and they're terrible and they just do terrible things in the world, right? And so I explored all kinds of different things, and yet the place where I kept finding myself drawn to, or the people that I was drawn to, or the communities that I was most drawn to were these communities of progressive Christian people, to my utter dismay, right, and my utter resistance. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. Like, that's not what I want. But I kept sort of following that path, ended up becoming involved in a congregation that asked me to work with their young people. My social work experience had all been with adolescents, so they said, you know, would you come and direct our youth program? And I told the pastor at the time, who's one of my good friends, I said, I don't own a Bible. And he said, that's okay, I want you to work with the students, I want you to do the service learning program, like, you can figure it out together. I don't want someone to tell them what to believe, I want someone to journey with them. And I thought, well, okay, I can do that. And the journeying with is pretty, I think that's a big part of who I am. I enjoy journeying with people. I enjoyed that in my social work experiences. I loved it when I was doing youth ministry, going out and encountering different things, coming back with students, asking ourselves, what does that mean? We used to read, we called it Wisdom from the Ages and Sages, right? And some of it was scripture, and some of it was poetry, and some of it was music lyrics that they would bring in that spoke to them, and some of it was stuff from Buddhist traditions and Islam and Judaism and all kinds of other wonderful things that we brought in. And students started developing their own spiritualities and sense of faith by what made sense to them. And I loved that, and that sent me on a quest to this particular place as a student. And I came and earned 2 degrees here. I did an MDiv and then STM. And I also was doing some community organizing at the time that was very much interfaith related in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I absolutely loved that, loved the interfaith work that I was doing, loved the studies that I was taking on here. I was just getting really excited about all of it. But I found myself in the interfaith work that was happening when I was in these circles of people who were absolutely dedicated towards coming together around really important social issues and creating change and working across lines of differences and partnering up together. I kept feeling off and on that there was this weird elephant in the room, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, and I just wrestled with it all the time. And I was having coffee with one of my woman friends who was in the group. She happened to be, she was a member of the Unitarian Church. And she was sitting and she was talking to me. We were talking about some of the other people that we worked with and the good work that they were doing, and she was referring to one of our Muslim co-workers, colleagues, friends, just this amazing, stellar woman in the community. And she said, I know, we owe her such a debt of gratitude, she's so great, she's such a wonderful leader. And then she did this thing, right? And she leaned in and she just said, I just feel so badly. She's so, you know, Muslim women, they're so oppressed. And I just wish that she could really just own who she is as a woman. And at that moment, I was like, that's it. That's the problem, right? And the problem that I originally named was what I called, I was like, oh, this is an Islamophobic problem. There's something about this. And so I did a degree. I went on and did another degree because of that conversation. I did a Master of Sacred Theology to think about, I wanted to explore how Islamophobia how that narrative was corrupting really good interfaith work. That was my question. And I was questioning, and I'm doing this thing, and I'm pulling my hair out, and this, and that, and the other thing. At the same time, in my life, I'm also involved in doing anti-racism training. I became an anti-racism trainer. I was doing work with Crossroads in Kalamazoo, Michigan, which then led to working here with Chicago Roar here in Chicago. And all of a sudden, there was one day that I was like, oh my gosh, the problem is not Islamophobia, the problem is Christian privilege, right? The problem is the normative, hegemonic role of Christianity in the United States. Bingo, bango, paper writes itself, not really, but closer. Paper writes itself, and I realized, and then I started thinking, I'm like, oh, and this is why, to me, this is now my like big universal picture of why a person who was so resistant to Christianity became a Christian person. Because I think the importance of those of us, especially in the United States, who identify as Christian, being able to name that powerful, normative, this is, everything else is other, Christianity is the way to be, and the way that that is just a part of our society, culture, we breathe it, we sleep it, we drink it in the same way that racist narratives are out there, this is also out there, and in fact they are all wrapped up together, one and the same. I think they're two sides of the same coin. But we need people to be uncovering that and thinking about that in order to really do transformative work. That absolutely just became a thing for me. And then after I graduated, I stayed here at CTS doing a lot more accompaniment work with folks who were thinking about coming to CTS. I don't have to tell you this because like more than half the people in this know that. And I remember sitting and talking with you on the phone and in my office and hearing your journeys and listening to the ways that you were exploring your paths and finding your way. And then I had an opportunity, this opportunity opened up at Knox College. And I thought, gosh, is that really something that I want to do, right? Like, am I going to make a change? Is this where I want to go? And because there has never been, they have always been so secular, so fiercely secular is what they call themselves. Well, that was me, right? I was fiercely secular. And this fall I was able to take a group of students to Standing Rock. There was a call issued to religious leaders to come. And so I went with 15 students and we spent a couple days in Standing Rock and there was wonderful interfaith prayer and it was just an amazing experience. And just this past week, a student who works for the magazine at Knox asked if they could interview me about the experience and I said, sure. So she came in and we sat and we talked for probably an hour. And toward the end of the conversation, she said, can I ask you something like a little odd? And I said, sure. And she said, when you took this position here at Knox, did you imagine that you would do things like this? Like take students to protests? And I said, yeah. And she said, but you're a religious person. And I said, oh, wow, right? And so now I'm like, okay, am I talking now to my 20-year-old self or am I talking to this young person right here? And so I talked to her and I said, we thought back to various different moments in time. We thought about Selma, we thought about the anti-apartheid movement. We thought about all kinds of movements and who was leading those movements, right? And it was, you could see her eyes open and the connections start being made in her head. And so the work that is being undertaken at Knox, that I have the opportunity to help shape and guide, is not only interreligious work, but also the work with faitheists and atheists, right? And pulling in people on all sides of that, who have a variety of ways of sort of ethically framing the world and their role in the world and who are deeply committed to social justice and change, some of whom have religious stories and traditions that shape that, some of whom do not, and understanding and we need to work together and grow together. And also, the question that I continue to ask the students, even in that, of course supporting people right where they are, is to always get back to, but where does your hope come from? Because I can't imagine doing this work without something undergirding it that helps me know where my hope comes from.
Question. So talk about the challenges as well as the joys of the work that you do.
Well, the challenges are, for me on a personal level, many of the activities in community organizing take place on a Saturday. And so that's the Shabbat. So I find myself in a position where I don't go. But over the years, I've had congregants that have come and said, Rabbi, is it okay to do this on, for an instance, August the 6th, there was this huge march that we had down Kedzie, taking and walking the path of Martin Luther King. And so I didn't participate. But when congregants asked, Rabbi, can I do this walk? I said, today you'll be Abraham Joshua Heschel and you'll pray with your feet. So go. And don't feel bad. But it's not going to be all day, so come to service immediately. So that's one of the aspects of challenge for me. But the rewards are fantastic. I mean, religious organizations in this neighborhood and social service organizations worked to, over 5 years. I know that maybe some of the students here were a part of getting a trauma center, level 1 trauma center at the University of Chicago, and they were there, and that succeeded, and that was extremely rewarding to get some of the big shots out of their towers and getting them to come and sit down at the table with us at the church and communicate, and the young people, the tenacity of the young folks that just started that whole process after one of their friends was shot or something and had to be taken to another place because they didn't have level 1 trauma at the U of C. The young man died, and just to see what their tenacity, what it meant, that you can make a change. You can effect change. And it may take a while. There's no changes overnight, but you must have the tenacity and the willingness to stick with it. And to appreciate, I think, 2 things. When Jacob was leaving his homeland, the sun set on him. And so one commentator says that, he was getting ready to go into a kind of a dark phase in dealing with his father-in-law Laban. But when he came home 20 years later, and after his engagement with the angel, the sun was rising. And so setting put him in a position where he was in struggle. And anything that you want to fight for, you have to struggle for. And if we want to struggle, we have to fight for, I think, religious tolerance across the board. We have to fight against racism. I was a Christian. One of the reasons that I left was nobody in the Bible looked like me. It just, and yet it's the same time when I'm going to school in South Carolina and I go to the doctor's office, from Chicago, I just walked in the door. And somebody said, hey, N, didn't you see whites only on the door? Well, you know what? All the people went to church on Sunday. When I went to the movie theater, going into the main floor, it says, excuse me, N, you sit in the balcony. So I've experienced that. That wasn't in 1920s or 30s or 40s. That was in 1967, after President Johnson signed this Civil Rights Bill. Simply because it's a law does not mean it's in the hearts of all people. And so one of our responsibilities and our obligations is to make certain that these things should be a part of people's being. That the humanity, if we use this idea that mankind, womankind, that we're all made in the image of God, let's really learn to start respecting and seeing God in everyone. And not decompartmentalizing and putting you in this little book and you in this group. As I told a group some years ago, if you imagine a huge mountain, mountains have a lot of pathways. And these pathways are all of our various religious communities. But we're all trying to get to a summit, to the summit of this mountain. And so your path may be Hinduism, Baha'i, Islam, Christianity, Catholic, Protestant. It doesn't matter. You know, you may be an atheist, but yet on the path. On your path to the summit. And we have to simply respect the paths that every other person is on. That's on a different path than ours. And that's the struggle, and that's the fight, and that's what I work towards.
Struggles and joys, is that what you asked?
Yes.
Did you have something to say right away? Or?
No problem.
Okay. I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in recent years, specifically in the last year, is really looking at the intersectionality of doing interfaith work alongside other movements, whether that be racial justice, whether that be LGBT rights, whatever that may be, and how that does not quite comfortably sit all the time. Specifically because when you do interfaith work, you're working with a much broader set of values, and it's always a delicate balance to kind of have that conversation and to figure out how you work together on some things and then hold to your values on other things and say, that's something we can't come together on, but let's find something else that we can come together on. And I think that is, it's very easy to go back into your corners when you're navigating those difficult issues. And it's very easy to do a very watered down way of doing interfaith work, to say we're just not going to talk about any of the elephants in the room and have a nice conversation about text and food and call it a day, right? So I think that's where the messiness of interfaith work comes, is when you're navigating these really difficult things, and at the same time building relationships and recognizing that there are things that you may deeply disagree on, and where do you go from there, and what does that look like? And that's something that I feel like is a lifelong journey for me as someone who's in interfaith work, is always looking for that balance, always navigating that you know, that hole or that gap or whatever that may be. I also tend to think that in the current context of how we do activism in politics, there is also some tension between how you stand for values and fight for justice in various movements, and at the same time how you are identified as pro-engagement, and what does that mean? How do you engage with someone who, you know, for all purposes is against you, and what does that look like? So I think that's just such it's so complex that I don't think there's a black and white answer. I don't think that there's, you know, I would say it's difficult for me to take a complete position and say I'm always pro-engagement, or I'm always going to hold to my values and never going to compromise on anything. But the question is, what's the balance there? So for example, for me, there's been many times when I've been asked to come in front of a congregation that's not Muslim to talk about what it means to be American and Muslim, and one of the first questions I'll get is, but you're not like those other Muslims over there, right? So, and to me, there's a part of me that's just like, I cannot believe I just got asked that question again for like the 50th time. But there's also a part of me that's like, but they need to hear this, right? So I personally make the decision to commit to answering that question and to engaging with that person, even if that's difficult for me personally. And I respect people who will maybe choose not to engage that, right? And I think people have to make that decision for themselves and figure out where they stand and how they engage. So I think that's some of both the joys and the complexities of doing this work.
Yeah, thank you. I'm feeling some of that. So I'm new in my position, so there's a lot of, I don't know what I'm doing, so that's the biggest that's the biggest challenge, right? And no one's done it before, so I really can't screw up.
That's where the real part is.
I'm like, oh, yeah, this is how it always goes, right? Right? So there's that.
We're not going to put this video on YouTube.
Yeah, hi Max, friends.
Or now you will.
That was a quick stint for Lisa. So the joys for me in that role has been getting to know the students and getting to know the student bodies. One of the challenges, though, that's emerging very quickly for me, and I think it speaks to some of what you were just saying, is it's a very progressive campus. It's a very left-leaning campus. So there are a lot of student organizations specific to different sort of social justice movements or different identities. And there's a lot of competition between those different movements or student groups or houses or living learning communities or whatever. Competitions for resources, competitions for who's in charge of this particular rally, whose voices are welcome at the rally, who needs to sit down, who needs to take a back seat, who can come to the table, who shouldn't be at the table. And for my first term there, I've been observing. It's one of my strategies, just to go in, like, I don't know, right? I'm not gonna come in with all of the solutions, but it is something that needs to be addressed, and especially dealing with young people who aspire, and who already are very much social activists and want their lives to be very much involved in social activism, thinking about that work of intersectionality. And how do we say, I was at there's a conference every spring, it's called the White Privilege Conference, and I think that's a terrible name because it's really not people getting together to celebrate white privilege. It's about dismantling white privilege, but it's called the White Privilege Conference. It's really, really excellent. I would encourage everyone to go, but just that caveat. But I was there, and there was a speaker one time who said, your complicated ally is still your ally, right? So that person who doesn't quite get it right, the person who's using language that's a little bit like, what did you just say? What just came out of your mouth, right? If that person is there, they're still your ally. And so for me, one of the challenges is figuring out how do we make space and call people in on a wider and wider basis, right? So that, so that we can work together, right? And then also take the time and be patient enough to engage and to educate and to give information in ways that are kind and loving, that say, when you said that thing, this is how it sat with me. I just wanted you to be aware, right? Rather than, that's it, out of the room, you're gone, you're done. And if we can't, in this moment, in this political moment, like this feels life and death to me, right? We either have to figure out how we absolutely link our arms together and say, we are standing side by side. We are not going to allow, these actions and this hate and this divisiveness to roll over us. We will absolutely stand here together, but we can't do it by ourselves, and we can't do it if we can't find ways to work across. And I think, for me, the importance of being able to do interfaith work is it gives us that space to really tackle some of those challenging things right up front, exactly what you named, of the ways that we can say we are absolutely committed to resisting this. However, there are some topics that are going to be really hard and dicey for us to talk about, right? And if we can figure out how to do that there, then how does that then translate wider and wider and wider, right? So that we can keep finding ways to hold on to one another and say you don't have to agree with me on every single thing. Our values don't have to be the same on every single issue. But in these particular things, this is where we are absolutely committed to being together with one another and to absolutely, not even having each other's backs, right? But like, I will step in front. When someone comes for you, I will step in front. I don't have your back, right? But I'll step out. Right? That's what we do. So, yeah, a lot of joy there. Challenges.
Why don't we take some questions from the floor? Are there questions for our guests? And this is CTS, and so I know you're not that quiet. So.
We might be at this point in the semester, just saying.
Okay, I'll throw this out while you guys are thinking. Can you speak to the critical nature of the time we're in? I know a lot of us here at CTS have been going through almost a time of mourning as Rabbi Mikva talked post-election 2016, and the divisiveness. I put it in chapel the other day that we are, I think, as divided as the Union and the Confederate armies. That is the nature of the rhetoric. I shouldn't say that we are, but the rhetoric that was put forth to try to divide us on so many fronts. And so I think of the work that we do here at CTS and the work that you're all doing and the critical nature of that work at this particular time, but I would like to hear from your voices on that.
Well, I believe that it's vital to stand in front of, not have your back, but have the capacity to stand in front. Rhetoric is a very dangerous thing. And a lot of the rhetoric that we've heard prior to the election and even since the election, I felt to be very disturbing. And I mean, I mentioned the fact that at our congregation, if there's any move to make any person of the Muslim faith have to register, that I think that it's something that all citizens in this country need to stand up to do, and then they'll say, you know what, this is not a good idea, because now we've got 300 million people that have to register. But to engage, and oftentimes, I think that organizations like CTS, is there any engagement with very, 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 very strict and traditional Christian institutions that don't see the world through the lenses that you look at the world through here? To engage with someone through Oral Roberts and some of these other institutions like this that have a very, I think, rightist perspective, that engage, and they feel rightly so, in white privilege. That is, it's their privilege. I told some pastors when I was in the AME church, I said, you know what I'd like to see done? He said, what? I said, I think that if we're going to have a Bible, why do we have to have anybody's picture in it? Why would we give a projection of what a Savior looks like? Can I tell my children that that's what the Savior looks like? Don't look like me, don't look like their mama, don't look like none of their grandparents, their great-grandparents. But it looks like somebody that don't even speak to them when they're walking up and down the street. Or, God forbid, maybe they're driving and they engage with the police, and it doesn't matter where you might happen to be. So we, in coming out of comfort zones, I think particularly in the Christian elements of the Jewish community as well, where there are really, in places, they're in Mitzrayim, a narrow place. They're in a very narrow place, Mitzrayim. And they need to be engaged in coming out. If it's going to really work, if we're going to move forward, otherwise this divisiveness is going to linger. I was the speaker this year for Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is the Night of Broken Glass in 1938, when the Nazis began burning synagogues, schools, Jewish businesses, you name it, arresting, no charges whatsoever. Many of their positions in academia had already been taken away in government. And having lived in the South, having my parents who grew up in the South, hearing all of the stories of my relatives from the South, from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and myself in the 60s, this rhetoric resonates to me as very dangerous, very divisive. And as a religious person, I have an obligation, I feel, to reach out to the mainstream Christian community and to engage, if they will engage. Because sometimes you get to a place where they simply don't want to talk because their religious and theological perspectives is what it is. It's right there, and it's it, and they're on their way to heaven, and you don't get in here and don't come into this land. And so, so do we just leave them there, or do we attempt to reach out? Do we attempt to say, this isn't right. We need to talk about this. We can't have a society where somebody says, get them out of here. Somebody says, I remember the good old days and what we used. What does that mean? What does that mean? No one ever asked them, what are you talking about? What is it? What are the good old days? Who are the days good for? So, and to get there, you have to be willing to engage. And to engage, you have to be comfortable in your own religious skin, to engage with others in their religious skin, and hopefully they will have that same level of comfort in their religious ideology and theology to be engaging and to talk about the various issues that are confronting us as a society. But racism is paramount, and selling fear. We're fearful of everybody. Oh, no, oh no, look at these scarves. What was that scarf mean? Merkel today said, oh, well, we're going to have to maybe come up with some idea of maybe at times when, the Muslim women won't, you have to say, well, you can't wear, the scarf at this particular time. Why? Why? So, to appease others in their fears and to leave them in their fear? And I don't think that that's where we need to be. We need to challenge. We need to challenge people to raise them out of their fears.
In that same thought, a thread, I mean, I think what we're seeing more than anything is that a certain kind of rhetoric is feeling very empowered to be out front, right? So even today, as many of you may have heard, last night the University of Chicago was basically vandalized with flyers of Adolf Hitler across campus, with swastikas across campus by a local neo-Nazi group. They are still figuring out whether they're students or not. But that can happen now, and it's not surprising, and it's one of many things, right? So, and that to me, as a person of faith, as a Muslim, as an interfaith leader, as a mother, it's scary. It's scary when my 5-year-old son who's in kindergarten comes home and he's like, oh, we talked about cops in school today. And I was like, oh, that's great, how was that? He's like, I don't know if they were the good cops or the bad cops. And I'm just like, I don't know what to say to you. Like, I have no idea what to say to you as a 5-year-old. I literally do not know what to say to you. And those are the times that we live in. And for me, in thinking about it, I've been reading a book recently called Learning as a Way of Leading. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. And there's a chapter in it that talks about this concept of critical hope, which is being hopeful and having hope, but at the same time not being inactive in that hope, right? So using your hope to take action, to basically pursue justice. And that to me has really been one way of thinking about how to emotionally respond and productively respond to whatever is happening around us. And I've also been thinking a lot about sort of our legacy as people of faith and people who maybe turn to stories in our own traditions, the legacies that we're pulling from, and what does that mean? So the one thing that I'll share with you that I'm kind of, this is an experiment for me, as a thought experiment with you all, and would love to hear feedback. Something that I've been thinking a lot about is the story of Hagar, or Hajar as we call her in the Muslim tradition, who is the second wife of Abraham. She's a black woman. She was a slave before Abraham married her. And at some point, he is commanded to take her into the desert of Saudi Arabia, where Mecca currently stands, and to leave her there by herself with her son, Ishmael. And as Abraham leaves her and walks away, she kind of calls out to him and says, has God commanded you to leave us here? And he doesn't respond. And she asks him again, has God commanded you to leave us here? And he says, yes. And then she says, then I am satisfied to be with God. And he leaves. And as the milk in her breast dries up and Ishmael begins to cry, Hagar is hopeful, but she's not inactive, right? So she runs between these two mountains looking for help, looking for something, and invoking the mercy of her Lord. And that's when Gabriel appears to her and he strikes the ground, and that's where water emerges. And the spring is called Zamzam. And in some poetic way, I like to think that, Mecca, which is the holiest city for Muslims, came out of the footsteps of a black mother. Like, that's where this holy sanctuary emerged, out of the footsteps of a black mother. So to use that as a metaphor in terms of creating a Mecca or a sanctuary today in the face of this rhetoric, I feel like in a lot of ways, we have to anchor that in the footsteps of Black mothers and really think about those foundational issues that we have in the United States as a country and really think about how we use those and build around those to really create this new space and to call upon the promise that we have in America's founding and to really make that a reality.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I won't add too much more because I know we're going to have an essay in a moment. But I will just say, both of what you're both saying is resonating a lot with me. I've also been thinking a lot about, so when I think about my responsibility as a white person in the work of anti-racism, there is certainly work that I do alongside my sisters and brothers of color as an ally. But perhaps the place where I can affect change most is speaking to other white people who may push back and may resist concepts of racism. I would much rather hang out in places where people already get that and be able to sort of say like, isn't this terrible, what's going on, you know?
Yeah.
But really, where do I have the ability to create change? And it's hard, and it's hard to do that work. And I think so too, in interreligious engagement, just as you were saying, I have the ability, because of my credentials, I have the ability to speak to in some Christian places where maybe one or both of you might not be welcome, right? And so what do I do with that, with the fact that I have that privilege as a Christian person? And where do I go and how do I do that? And how do I speak? And I've also been thinking a lot about what is it that actually moves people toward change, right? And when I think about that, I try to think about where people might be right now. Whatever framework, rhetoric is appealing to them, is filling them, is making them feel like this is the path, this is the right thing to do, this is where I will find security, this is whatever. I think back on my own life, okay? I wasn't always this person, right? I didn't always hold these thoughts in my head. So here's my true confession. When I was a sophomore in high school, I wrote an essay on the need, there was no need to have a feminist movement at all because women had it better than men, because women had more opportunities than men did, because men had to work, but women could either choose to stay home or could have a career. So this tells you something about the bubble where I grew up in, right, and the role models that I had around me. But that's who I once was. I'm not that person anymore. But to go from that 16-year-old person to this person, I had people along the way who helped me, right? And who helped move me in different ways and who helped to give me new information and to share their stories with me so that I thought, oh, wait, not every woman has that choice. Oh, that's a problem, right? Like, you know, so the narrative started expanding quickly for me. So too, you know, when I was a little kid, I watched Sesame Street, and I grew up in a house, and everybody's, you know, color doesn't matter, everyone's loved, everybody's the same, right? My kindergarten class had, like, you know, people of all different colors. We even had books with people of different colors. I had friends that were different races. There's no such thing as racism, right? And it was when I read Why Are the Black Kids Sitting in the Cafeteria? That was the first moment that I was like, oh, and I was in college at the time when I read that. And, right, but it helps me to have a gentler spirit with people who are different from me if I can think back and know I once embraced ideals that I now find deeply problematic, outright wrong, racist, horrible, right? But, and so the fact that I was capable of growth and change gives me hope that there is room in other hearts for growth and change. I don't know if that's something that I've been leaning into and at least trying to find, because like you, I feel like I've been in mourning, absolute shock and mourning since the election. I just, it's really taking a toll, and yet there's work to be done. So that's a place that I'm drawing from to try and do the work.
At this time, we are going to make a shift, and we are going to have our essays on let Rabbi Mikva introduce that.
So some of you have been around here long enough, maybe, to actually know Rabbi Shulman. Herman Schulman started teaching here first, co-teaching with Dr. Andre Lecoq. And then he was invited to teach his own course on Judaism, which of course was under the category of Christian heritage. And because that was the category that we had for such things. But he taught here faithfully for over a decade because he was committed to the idea that leaders from this community would go out and make change. And that if they knew something about other traditions, that the changes they would make would be that much more profound, that much more beautiful. First came to Chicago in the 50s. He had already been a rabbi for about a decade. He was a rabbi at Temple Emmanuel. One of the interesting things he did in his own career was build a friendship that was so close with Cardinal Bernardine, really sort of anchoring Jewish-Catholic dialogue, not only in the city, but in the region, and providing a model nationwide. The friendship grew so close, right? That this work also is so much about relationship. That friendship grew so close that when Cardinal Bernardine died, he had left in his request that Rabbi Schulman participate in his funeral. It was the first time a rabbi had ever participated in a cardinal's funeral. But those are some of the connections that can make this work work. In any event, we do a number of things to try to keep his work moving and growing here. My chair is named after him. And so too is this essay award, because he was so instrumental in inspiring so many of our students along the way to see themselves as interreligious leaders. So that's Rabbi Schulman. I'm not going to introduce Teresa or her essay, because she's going to share it with us, and that will be Farka.
Okay. I'm not going to read you my human Bible paper. That's the other one I have.
That's probably better to withstand.
Okay, yeah.
Or if you want to sit,
Or
would
sit
you
right.
like to
Oh,
sit?
yeah, can I?
An upfront chair.
That'd be awesome. Thanks. So I also went to Standing Rock just as a prelude. I wrote this before I went. I went over Thanksgiving break for 5 days and spent some time there with 11 other people that a colleague of mine and myself brought with us to provide service. But I wrote this sort of from a space of a deep calling that I felt in sort of the social justice and faith intersection point of sort of a call to be in this space in solidarity with them in spirit, sort of for all of us. So it's called Mitakue Oasin, which means we are all related, and that is Lakota, a call to stand with Standing Rock. 500 clergy, representing numerous religious traditions, marched, prayed, and preached the unifying gospel of liberation at Standing Rock this past Thursday, November 3rd, 2016. They came from across the country after a call for increased presence and witness came from the camps, which have been growing in size and presence since August, when Indigenous leaders and leaders from around the country and hundreds of tribes began to gather together to protect sacred land and water from the impending Dakota Pipeline project. This project threatens to contaminate local water supply to the surrounding tribes, one of the few resources still available to the struggling population of Lakota Sioux people existing in the rugged prairie of North Dakota. This call for public support and presence on the reservation came following an escalation of violence by law enforcement against water protectors erupted a few days prior. It was answered by a mass response from communities of faith, across traditions and ideologies, with a common humanity driving them into the grasslands to stand beside those who are suffering the impact of genocide, violence, degradation, and devastation, co-opted by the doctrine of discovery, a Christian doctrine which gave religious authority to colonization and genocide across the globe, and most acutely in the Americas. The first time I experienced Indigenous life on the reservation, it was 7 years ago on Pine Ridge Reservation. It was another time of joining together across traditions for a Taizé pilgrimage of trust. People from across the country and the globe in their 20s and 30s set up camp for 3 days at the edge of a deep cavern in the Black Hills of South Dakota. It was the largest gathering of Native and non-Native people on Pine Ridge since the Wounded Knee standoff in 1973. The 1973 incident was also the last mass standoff of Indigenous protests until today at Standing Rock. Each day we would descend into the cavern for prayer and chanting from different cultures, tribes, traditions, and languages, chanting in Lakota, English, Swedish, French, until we represented all the languages present in shared prayer. We ascended each day and night for healing circles, circles of lament, circles of dance. Late into each and every night, the drums echoed into the cold air as ancient rhythms banged out calls to the hills and the stars and the ancestors. We visitors were offered witness to the ancient practices in praise of Creator God as seen through the lens of America's first peoples. I remember one night speaking with an Episcopal pastor who also, like many of the Christian practitioners on the reservation, practices both the old rituals and unfolded the ancient beliefs with his Christianity. He told me the story of the Star People, saying it was told that they lived in the stars and guided the people when they were nomadic for thousands of years, so that they would find their way. He seamlessly recalled how this story related to the Christian lore of the three wise men, following the stars offered to them by God to guide their way to their sacred one. One elder gave a workshop on forgiveness, telling of the wisdom of his grandmother, helping him through the grief and pain of suffering the physical, emotional, and sexual abuses of the boarding schools, helping him through the Korean War where he fought for the nation that had been his abuser, and offered him her understanding of forgiveness and the Creator. He said, "She told me that it was like we were flowers in the grass. We can be trampled by the heavy boot, but it also makes us stronger, and with time we will rise again." That trip began a process of unfolding of my own Indigenous heritage and working within communities of faith to create awareness and healing practices around the doctrine of discovery. The ownership of my own spiritual community's historic complicity in the genocide and abuses of Native people, and my complicated history as one who is part of a culture of colonization, which also carries the blood and genetic coding of the oppression of my own Indigenous ancestors. It also brought me to today as I reflect on the words of the wise grandmother and the forgiving elder, and I see the water protectors on sacred land, rising from the trampled boot and calling the world to see, listen, witness, and be present for the necessary transformation that has been waiting for its moment of birth to arrive. It also reminds me of the call in this moment, answered by 500 faith leaders this past week, and continuing to be beckoned from the prairie and into our communities. For people of deep belief in their respective traditions, to stand with the people of Standing Rock, lovingly from each of our own understanding of God, divine, morals, and ethics, but loving with action. It reminds me of the call to Selma, which once roused a nation and a world to listen to the degradation and violence against Black bodies. Creator God rumbles in the Black Hills and the Prairie Plains for us to listen and respond. It calls through the Lakota words that I learned first on Pine Ridge Reservation. Itakawe Owasi, we are all related.
So we want to thank our guests for being here today. We want to thank Teresa for sharing with us her essay. I also want to let you know that tomorrow's chapel will have a standing in solidarity with Standing Rock. So though the president has said that we would not move forward with the pipeline, the corporate leaders have said that they are still planning to move forward. Mm-hmm. And so we are still standing in solidarity. And so Lynn Young, who is one of our online students, but she is from Michigan, and she is a Native American as well. And she will be with us, and Teresa myself and some others will do a ritual in solidarity. So we hope that you will join us in that as well. Again, thank you so much to each of you. There is still food out there, and I hope that you will take some time to fellowship with our guests.